Greetings friends and welcome to the story of the world that was. I'm Lorcan and this is Only War. Quickly before we start, a huge thank you to everyone for supporting the channel so far. It's been busy behind the scenes here setting things up to build towards a more regular upload schedule. If you ever feel like buying me a coffee, there's now a tip jar, and I'm proud to have a few war allies on board in Goblin Gaming from the UK, MTech Cave in the US, and Gap Games in Australia for great discounts on Games Workshop and loads of other gubbins. Using the links in the description when you next succumb to the whispers of Slaanesh will really help the channel. So thank you again for joining me on this journey, and I hope I earn your subscription today for all things Warhammer. And now we'll get into why we're all here, shall we? This is meant to be an overview through the major events and most influential personalities in the history of the old world. It's for those who have an interest in the timeline of the world that was, whether to know about the distant origins of their Age of Sigmar force or Total War faction, or are looking to plunge into the old world again when it finally returns. There are many in-depth tales I'm looking forward to telling about the characters and factions of the old world, but this will aim to be a more digestible summary, cross-checked against as many original sources as possible. This series will break the timeline apart at logical points from the earliest days, before even the arrival of the ancient life-seeding Old Ones, eventually all the way through to the rise of Archaon the Ever-Chosen, and the end times. The dates used throughout will be based on the Imperial calendar, which counts year 1 as the founding of the Empire by Sigmar, with exact dates used when the original sources allow. In this first episode we'll travel from the most distant past, and the life that existed before the arrival of the near-godlike beings that gave us many of the races we know today, through to the Sundering of Ulthuan at the end of the Elven Civil War. I reject the vanity of men. I weep at their prideful ignorance. I know the greatness of the elder races that came before them, and the unimaginable divinity of the creatures that came before that. In my waking sleep I have witnessed the dawn, as though the most distant of paths were playing before my eyes. I have watched the great ones, the first ones, as they traversed the endless night and brought their glory and their horror to this poor, thin world. I have watched as these merciless things, these mortal gods, the first amongst all the elder races, raised up their works of matter and thought, careless of the boundaries between reality and unreality. They knew no boundaries, no measure or limit. They reached into the great void and warped all that is into all that should not be. They cast up mighty portals between all places and times, and bent the shapeless potentials of between realm to their will. But the end of these first ones, so great and so terrible, was written upon their every action, because the further they reached into the void, and the closer they stared at its divine patterns, the more they attracted its attention and all-consuming hunger. Even as these awesome beings created life as they wished, and where they didn't, they altered the creatures that existed before their coming, sculpting their bodies, souls, and minds to make the perfect slaves and experiments. So was it that tiny tendrils reached out from beyond, too weak to threaten or touch the first ones, but strong enough to caress the minds of their mortal servants. The minds of the child races clung blindly to these thin tendrils of chaos, carrying them back through the imperfections of the First One's will, and granting the void a foothold in the mortal plane. And so it was. The works of the First Ones were brought low, broken across the knee of chaos. Their great gateways trembled and fell, and the stray thoughts and nightmares, the waking desires and dreams that dwelt within the chaos realm, were created upon this pale reality. So arrived all magic, and all the monstrous gods and demons of our world. Who now, or then, could stand against them?
The old world has a frigid past of near-permanent ice age. Few of the dominant creatures of that most distant of times were able to persist as they had evolved to be following the arrival of the star-faring species known as the Old Ones. The enigmatic strangers arrived on their silvered ships from an empire that spanned both the vastness of the cosmos and time itself. They were a civilization of almost inconceivable technological advancement. True masters of science, they linked the worlds that they claimed by a series of portals through which they could travel inconceivable distances with but a lone stride. On their near-endless wanderings, they took an apparent unknowable interest in the old world, and the creation of creatures that could potentially ensure its continued existence. They placed great stellar gateways at each pole, and became frequent visitors. For the Old Ones to set their plan in motion, they used unimaginable powers to shift the planet's orbit closer to its warming sun. Before then, near-permanent ice sheets had covered much of the globe, with the more temperate areas at the equator. The skies were dominated by mighty dragons, and powerful shaggoths stalked stone horns and stegodon through the lands. The increasing solar radiation sent the ice sheets retreating, and verdant forest biomes developed in the newly emerging continental masses. Dwelling in these lush green realms, they created servant creatures to tend to their needs. The first spawning of the Slan mage priests produced beings of prodigious intellect that became trusted viziers to the Old Ones, capable of withstanding and deciphering the unknowable teachings of beings near omnipotent. Living fearful primitive existences amongst the behemoths of the ancient past, they found creatures that, while imperfect, had taken paths leading to evolutionary traits that could be sculpted and tweaked over time to create the first elves, dwarves, and men. Of those creatures with less desirable traits and no place in their great plans, they were far from benevolent beings. The warming climate allowed them to swiftly create the Saurus, whose warriors would eradicate these native races with cold-blooded efficiency, and with unquestionable loyalty to the Slan passing down their judgments. The Skinks were added to the society of lizardmen as builders and overseers of their magnificent temple cities, set out at very specific locations under detailed instructions, forming a globe-spanning geomantic web. This matrix of natural energy flowed through them and could be drawn upon by the Old Ones as needed. Unfortunately for the Old Ones, malign forces from the impossible dimension that linked to the polar portals began to coalesce as full sentient entities that hated the Old Ones, and possibly having glimpsed a portent of that future, it is likely the Old Ones created the races of the Old World with the eternal battle against the Masters of the Realms of Chaos and their minions in mind. The elves were highly gifted with magical aptitude, the dwarves industrious and resilient, and the primitive humans adaptable and prolific. It was around the time of the creation of these species at the hands of the Old Ones that the first greenskins appeared, Their own shamans tell of the gods Gork and Mork descending from the heavens to populate the world with orcs and goblins. The Old Ones deemed the Greenskins a threat to their plan, but despite the best efforts of their Saurus legions, they could not eliminate them, and they would continue to menace the fledgling races with their aggressive nature. For 400 years, the races of lizardmen, elves, and dwarves developed their societies, guided directly or less so at the direction of the Old Ones. The lizardmen in their temple cities in Lustria and the Southlands, the elves isolated and protected on Ulthuan, and the dwarves starting to settle the mountainous regions of the world, alongside the primitive humans and hostile greenskin tribes roaming the forests and plains. Guided by their ancestor gods, the dwarven people went from primitive stone tool users living in the mountains of the Southlands, through to developing a mastery of metalworking and the colonization of the world's edge mountains to exploit the abundant mineral resources found there, with expeditions also founding strongholds in what would become Norska in the northwest, and east in the foothills of the Mountains of Morn. The great dwarven civilization, the Karaz-Angkor, began to take shape. As the encroachment of chaos from the poles became more pronounced, the Old Ones created the first Ogres as another brutish bulwark against the coming of darkness. The Halflings were also created, for a less knowable purpose. The eldritch machineries of the portals collapse, causing the polar gates to implode and forming permanent rifts linking to the realm of chaos. Raw magic spewed forth into the material realm, and meteors of warpstone impacted across the globe, casting congealed magic dust into the atmosphere. The insidious taint of chaos spread through the ancient forests and hung in the very air, and these malign energies created twisted abominations from the nomadic tribes of men and the prowling beasts. Under the sickly gaze of the newly formed cursed moon Warslebe, the first beastmen and Skaven were born. At the instant the polar gates collapsed, the Old Ones vanished from the old world, leaving the races they had created to face their fate in the first incursion of chaos. No one knows what truly happened to the ancient supreme beings, whether they were corrupted and destroyed, or simply deemed their world a lost cause, but their final act of influence may have been instructing their slan servants how to partially seal the Great Rend in reality that would have otherwise seen the ancient races of the old world immediately annihilated. Despite a sacrifice of fully half the slan to complete this undertaking, magical energy still flowed freely from the poles, and demons were now able to drag themselves into existence in the physical realm. Crystallizing from the tides of prismatic energy flowing from the poles, legions of demons were unleashed on the fledgling races of the world. As the most powerful ancient civilization, the lizardmen bore the brunt of the demonic aggression, and raised the largest armies the world has ever seen in an attempt to defend their realm. Despite the prodigious magical powers of the Slan, and the martial prowess of their Saurus forces, the lizardmen were forced back to their temple cities. In desperation, they enchanted the Lustrian jungle, turning it into a death trap of carnivorous plants, teeming with swarms of biting insects. They redirected rivers and caused volcanic eruptions, but nothing could stem the tide of madness that threatened to overwhelm all mortal life. Contact with the Southland temple cities was lost. Before long, the demonic forces led by the Lord of Change, Kerios Fateweaver, devised a way to breach the wards protecting the temple cities, and soon the great bastions of the lizardmen started to fall to ravaging hordes of chaos. Within 1,000 years, only a handful remained protected by the greatest of the remaining Slan, the first city of Itza, under the protection of the last surviving Slan of the first spawning, Lord Croak, came under a siege that would last for 400 years. The Dwarfs had initially been able to continue the expansion of the Karazhan core under the guidance of Grungni, Grimnir, and Valea during the early years of the Great Catastrophe, but by 4889 before the Imperial calendar, the Dwarf realm was besieged by a host of demons, led by the Great Unclean One Chugath, Plague Father. One of Nurgle's most favoured servants, Chugath, would be defeated at the walls of Karazhan, but he would return to plague the Dawi many times in the centuries to come. With the demonic encroachments becoming more frequent, in 4523 before the Imperial calendar, Valea retreats to Karazhan, and construction of the Great Hall in the Everpeak commences. This is the true beginning of Dwarf recorded history. The final great civilization that stood against the forces of chaos was the Azur, the High Elves of Ulthuan. The Old Ones had placed the magically attuned elves on a specially created island continent, and until the Great Catastrophe, they had lived in idyllic isolation in their paradise. The elves suffered greatly in the first centuries of the demonic invasion. Their isolation had left them unprepared for the hostility of the rampaging demons, and although magically attuned, they had used their skills for weaving peaceful spells. Lacking the skills and knowledge of warfare, the naive elves were driven to the brink of extinction over the next 900 years. However, just when their annihilation looked assured, a saviour rose to lead the Azur through the age of terror and strife engulfing them. Anarion, first, best loved, and most accursed of all the Phoenix Kings. Anarion had travelled the world before returning to defend his homeland from the chaotic legions. Realising the futility of their struggle, he travelled to the shrine of Asurion, offering himself to the sacred flame if the god would save his people. Despite gaining no response, Anarion held to his promise and cast himself into the Inferno, only to emerge not only unscathed but imbued with the power of Asurion. Anarion would be crowned the first Phoenix King, marking the start of Elven recorded history, and take Astariel the Everqueen as his wife. She would soon bear him 2 children, Morleon and Yvraine. Anarion rallied the remaining forces of the elves to him, and alongside Calador Dragontamer, the greatest wizard of the era, they were trained in the art of warfare, both physical and magical. With Anarion at their head, the elves started to push the demons back, even driving them from Ulthuan briefly, but they would soon return and the conflict dragged on, with only temporary moments of peace for the embattled elves. Seeing only a slow and inevitable defeat for their people, Calador devised a plan to create a cosmic vortex to drain magic from the world and deny the demons its sustaining power. But it was a desperate gamble, and one Anarion would not commit to. After a few years of respite, the demons returned in force, and in 4470 before the Imperial calendar, a demonic horde led by the Keeper of Secrets Nkari was able to overrun Avalorn and slay the Everqueen. Unknown to Anarion, his children were saved by the tree man Durthu, and driven by immeasurable grief and rage, Anarion travelled to the Blighted Isle, where he drew the blade Widowmaker from the altar of Cain and cursed his lineage forevermore. Having drawn the terrible weapon from its resting place since the dawn of time, Anarion returned and gathered the most embittered elves to him. He founded the kingdom of Nagaraith, and then surprised many by taking a second wife, the beautiful seeress Morathi, and soon she bore him a son, Malekith. Anarion's court at Nagaraith began to develop a dark reputation, and when the next demonic attack occurred, it was of such size and ferocity that it became clear to all but the Phoenix King that the world was soon to be doomed to eternal darkness. After 4 centuries of siege, Itza, the first city of the lizard men, is finally breached by the forces of chaos. Lord Croak unleashed spells of unimaginable power, and when his physical body was torn apart, his spirit fought on, unleashing magical energies that scoured the city of demons and saved Itza. On Ulthuan, Anarian's descent into madness prompted Calador to act to prevent the ending of the world. Firstly, he travelled out and made a first contact between the Azur and the Karazhan Core. He consulted with Grimnir, and they determined that portals to the realm of chaos had opened at the poles. The 2 races parted well, with an exchanging of gifts of friendship. Returning to Ulthuan in 4419, Calador now took it upon himself to call a convocation of the greatest High Elf sorcerers on the Isle of the Dead. Here they started the great ritual to drain magic from the world, and despite Anarian's objection, he was left with no choice but to defend the mages. At huge cost, the great ritual was completed, trapping Calador and the other mages in the final moments of the creation of the magical vortex. Anarian's forces just held the demons at bay, but he was mortally wounded, and once the ritual was complete, his final act was to travel on his great dragon, Indrognia, to the Blighted Isle, where he thrust Widowmaker back into the altar of Cain. With the ritual completed, the vast vortex drained away much of the magic that had flooded the world. Deprived of their lifeblood, the demonic forces were cast back into the seething realm of chaos. Ulthuan was a land in ruin, but at least its people had a future. The lizard men would set forth from their remaining temple cities and attempt to reconstruct what they could of their Lustrian empire. The Slann were believed to have intended on re-establishing contact and mentoring the younger races once their fortifications were rebuilt, but for reasons that will be discussed another time, they would enter an age of isolation from the later creations of the Old Ones. In the Old World, some primitive human tribes had turned to the worship of chaos during the madness of the Great Catastrophe. Most famously, the being that would become the first demon prince, Be'lakor, rose up not only to immortality, but to lead many of the demonic legions that would go on to ravage the lands he had walked as a mortal man. He would be banished alongside his new brethren with the creation of the Vortex. Be'lakor has his own video on the channel if you want to know more of his story. Those that continued their primitive nomadic ways after the Great Ritual still found themselves in a world seeped with hidden magical danger and twisted mortal followers of the dark powers. The beastmen, who had bred prolifically since their tainted creation, knew this as the start of 1,000 years where the human tribes were mostly prey, hunted through the dark forests. A year to the day after Anarian had returned the Widowmaker to the altar of Cain, the princes of Ulthuan convened at the shrine of Assyrian to elect a new Phoenix king. Malekith was the obvious candidate, an excellent general with both magical and martial prowess, but his upbringing in the cruel Nagarythain court counted against him. Prince Bel-Shanar of Tiranoc was chosen, much to Marathi's shrieked displeasure, but Malekith calmed her and bent the knee swiftly with apparent grace. He would soon choose to travel to the Old World, appearing to remove himself as a political player. The ancestor god Grimnir had expertly led the dwarf throngs in the defence of their realm during the first and second incursion, but as even holds they believed impenetrable began to fall to the advance of chaos in the last days before the Great Ritual, the warrior god of the dwarves decided he needed to take more direct action. Ritually shaving his head to a mohawk that would inspire the Slayer cults to come, he would take a small group of hardened warriors to the foothills of the Middle Mountains, before proceeding alone to stand on a third Chaos Gate, fighting back innumerable hordes of demons until the vortex was completed. However, Grimnir himself was never seen again. Under the leadership of Valea and Grungni, who had already passed on skills in mining and rune crafting to his people, the dwarfs would emerge from the safety of their deep underground strongholds into the light of a rising sun and the dawn of a golden age for the Karaz Angkor. For the next 300 years, the strongholds of the dwarfs were strengthened, with Karaz Akarak firmly established as capital of an ever-expanding domain, linked by a network of tunnels known as the Underway, or Ungdring Angkor in their tongue. With the dwarfs in the World Edge Mountains prospering, the remaining ancestor gods departed, and Snorri Whitebeard, eldest son of Grungi, was named High King. The remnants of chaos still threatened their lands, so the new High King soon came into contact with the High Elves, who under Phoenix King Bel-Shanar were themselves entering an age of prosperity, exploration, and colonization. Malekith had travelled to one of these new cities, Tor Alessi, on the eastern frontier, and there he made contact and common cause with the dwarfs, expanding their civilization west from the mountains. It was he who High King Snorri encountered and fought alongside as they hunted down the last Chaos armies and rampaging green-skinned tribes. Bel-Shanar would make Malekith his ambassador to the High King, and the two would build a long bond of friendship. The dwarves that had crossed the Great Skull Land were not as well protected as those in the World Edge Mountains during the Great Catastrophe. Their holds were not as deep, and with no ancestor gods to lead them, they had been cut off and thought lost. In reality, the dwarves of Zorn Nazgul found salvation in the patronage of Hashut, the Father of Darkness. In return for their devotion, he would ward them from mutation and suffering. The Chaos Dwarfs would rise up their entire civilization from this malevolent alliance. With their expansion and the establishment of trade routes, wealth flowed to Ulthuan, and while the elves prospered, a degree of decadence was creeping into their society. In Nagarath, Marathi had for some centuries encouraged cults of luxury, excess and pleasure that prospered in the ancient incense-filled temples. These cults began to spread their influence throughout the nobility of the 10 kingdoms of Ulthuan, unbeknownst to the Phoenix King. He may have been more aware of the trouble rising at home if Bel-Shanar had not been such a great seafarer himself, and he travelled to many of the new colonies in the Old World during his reign. In 2839 before the imperial calendar, he visited High King Snorri Whitebeard at Karaz Akarak, and despite some cultural differences, the two great and wise kings swore oaths of friendship between the races once more. Sometime after the peaceful passing of his friend, the High King, Malekith would grow restless in his duties to Bel-Shanar, and upon finding the circlet of iron in the ruins of Vorshgard in the frozen north, he began to delve deeper into forbidden dark magics. Losing himself to obsession, Malekith would grow in sorcerous skill as his mother Marathi's pleasure cults dug their tendrils of influence further into High Elf society. In 2751, Malekith returned to Ulthuan amid rumours of living sacrifice and associations with the forbidden gods within the pleasure cults. Their influence strongest in his homeland of Nagarath, where his mother Marathi was claimed by some to be the High Priestess. He appeared horrified by what he found in Nagarath, and denounced the entire coven of pleasure worshippers, including his mother, and imprisoned them on behalf of the Phoenix King. In secret, however, mother and son schemed Bel-Shanar's downfall. With cultists at every level of society, military action against the cults seemed inevitable. Malekith called Ulthuan's lords to a council of war at the shrine of Assyrian, under the pretext of requesting control of Ulthuan's armies to combat the rising tide of decadence. On the eve of the council, the princes would listen in horror as Malekith declared Bel-Shanar a secret devotee to the pleasure cults, and told them that he had taken his life with poison when confronted. The princes had known Belshazzar for many centuries, and none could believe Malekith's accusations. Too late they realized their personal peril as Malekith's forces encircled the shrine, and they were trapped within his inescapable grasp. The forces from Nagarath spilled the blood of the princes and their bodyguards on the floor of the shrine as Malekith strode forth to seize the blessing of Asuryan he felt was his stolen birthright. But where through his ordeal the flame had brought his father Anarian miraculous rebirth, to his traitorous son it inflicted the most torturous burns, leaving his body deeply scarred and his hair permanently stripped from his scalp. Malekith could not endure the sacred flame, but by pure force of will he was able to cast himself back out onto the platform from which he had first entered. On the verge of death, his followers would flee the shrine, bearing aloft his blackened, smoking body. But this would only be the start of the Elven civil war. As his devotees fled north with his ruined body, Morathi would take command in Malekith's stead for much of the campaign to come. The Nagarath legions were well versed in Anarian's warrior creed and moved swiftly to secure vital passages across the continent. On the other side of the world, a titanic warpstone meteorite emerged in the sky above the lands bordering Cathay. Here, far to the west of the Mountains of Morn, the Ogres created by the Old Ones had lived nomadic lives for centuries on the fertile rolling steppes. From their Cathayan neighbours they had learnt the secret of fire, and some trading with the humans was established. But as their numbers increased, some ogres began to pillage and even prey on the simple peasant children working the Cathayan fields. Needless to say, the celestial dragon emperor Zen Huang took a dim view of this development, and in a land of famed astromancers, the involvement of the Cathayans in what occurred next cannot be discounted easily. A light appeared in the sky, growing daily until it was a baleful orb that turned night into day, and drove the creatures of the steppes mad with fear. The meteorite slammed into the ogre homelands, boiling life away in a firestorm that annihilated 2/3 of the entire ogre population in an instant. The Great Maw did not stop on impact, but buried itself deep into the world, forming a maelstrom on the other side. The once verdant steppes were left a barren wasteland of searing desert and howling sandstorms, from which the ogre tribes were forced to descend into cannibalism in order to survive. Before departing the old lands, ogre legend tells of Gorth Onefinger, who led his tribe into the blasted wasteland in order to offer a sacrifice to this new ravenous deity. What he found was a gigantic crater filled with ridge upon ridge of jagged teeth, and a rippling muscular gullet that led down into nothingness. No longer able to travel east to Cathay due to the poisonous desolation left in the impact's wake, the majority of the surviving ogres, now blighted with a near-endless hunger, migrated into the mountain ranges to the west in order to search for new territory to call home. The migrating tribes began an ascent into what is now known as the Ancient Giant Lands, where they first encountered and came into contact with a race of beings known as the Sky Titans. An ancient race of greater size and intelligence compared to giants, the Sky Titans had lived mostly solitary existences in massive mountain citadels. They were individually incredibly powerful, but the ogres, despite the decimation caused by the birth of the Maw, still outnumbered them 100 to 1. Their isolationist lifestyles meant the Sky Titans could not unite to face the threat of the ogre tribes, and one by one the mountain fortresses fell, the victorious ogres enjoying bloody victory feasts in their colossal halls. Back in Ulthuan, the initially leaderless elves were slow to pursue the ruined Malekith, and were forced back by Morathi's aggressive actions, swiftly seizing control in the kingdoms of Tiranoc and Illyrian. Those princes who remained after the slaughter at the shrine elected Imric of Caledor, grandson of Caledor Dragon Tamer, as the third Phoenix King, and he took the name Caledor I in his honour. Some Nagarythine nobles were still loyal to the Phoenix King and rose up in rebellion against Malekith, but in the Battle of Dark Fen they were defeated by Morathi's army, and the survivors, led by a young Alethanar, began a guerrilla war against their traitorous kin. Caledor rallied the armies of the Elven kingdoms, but betrayal was rife throughout Ulthuan, with no region being free from the influence of Morathi's cult. The renegade priest of the smith god Vol, Hotek, was aided by sorcerers who once called Safari home in forging the suit of armour that would forever fuse Malekith's charred flesh with a rune-edged skin of black metal. Thus Malekith would once again ride out at the head of his armies, no longer a prince of Nagaryth, but now encased in the armour of midnight as the Witch King. Malekith's victories were many, but Caledor was a cunning general, using ambush tactics and luring the enemy into unfavourable engagements time and again. On the field of battle, Caledor was unmatched by any traitorous champion that issued him challenge, and his personal retinue of white lions and Sapharian mages ensured no assassin's blade, poison or magical affliction would befall him. Finally, in 2724 before the Imperial calendar, at the field of Malador, at the entrance to the passes of Nagaryth, the Witch King faced Caledor in personal combat. Both riding their monstrous dragons, it was the Phoenix King that would emerge the victor, slaying Malekith's chaos-tainted mount and forcing the Witch King to retreat. Without his leadership, Nagaryth's armies lost their resolve to fight and were routed and harried into the swampy lands to the north. Driven back to their home kingdom, the traitors turned to ever more desperate measures, dark sorceries and forbidden pacts, tainting their souls further, leading to the path of their development as a new, crueler and more sadistic elven society, the Druki, or Dark Elves. But against the armies of a now united Ulthuan, no dark arts could save them. Consumed by rage, Malekith decided upon one last ruthless bid for victory. He would lead his sorcerers in an attempt to unbind the magic of the Great Vortex and unleash the full horror of the realm of chaos once more. Despite the insanity of his plan, most of his disciples followed blindly, with only one turning away from the imminent destruction of all known life and sending a warning to Caledor. As the Witch King's sorcerers attempted to assert control of the vortex, the mages of Safari roused their own magic and wards to thwart the spell of unbinding, but the Witch King's magical might was too strong, and slowly he and his coven gained the upper hand. Demons added their magical aid to Malekith, and the final wards of the Elven defenders began to fail. Just as the vortex began to shift, the trapped mages of the Isle of the Dead, including Caledor Dragon Tamer, added their colossal power to the defenders, refusing to allow their work to be undone. The backlash of Eldritch power killed much of Malekith's coven and washed out further to the lands of Nagaryth itself. A wall of water 1,000 feet high smashed down as the seas rushed in to cover most of the benighted kingdom, and most of neighbouring Tiranoc, although in reality the whole continent suffered the effects of earthquakes, lightning, and raging seas. The Witch King was defeated once again, but his power remained, and in those last few hours the mightiest of his remaining sorcerers enchanted their keeps. So as the tidal waves came, the wizards' palaces broke free and floated on the surface of the ocean like icebergs. Aboard these floating bastions, the Black Arks as they would be called in later years, the Witch King and his minions fled the cataclysm they had unleashed on Ulthuan. Sailing to the north and west, they travelled across the churning seas, to the desolate wilderness of Nagaroth. And there, with the Sundering, we reach the end of our first chapter in the history of the Old World. The elder races created by the Old Ones were able to stave off immediate destruction following the collapse of the polar gateways that led to the Great Catastrophe and the first incursions of chaos. The lizard men in Lustria are left consolidating what remains of their former strength, but bereft of the direct leadership of most of the Slann, they enter their age of isolation. The Dwarfs will recover and expand in the aftermath to enter their Golden Age, first with the guidance of their ancestor gods, and then under the rule of the High Kings. The Elves too entered a Golden Age of colonization and trade, until the machinations of Malekith and Marathi plunged Ulthuan into a bitter civil war that would forever scar their island continent, and lead to the dividing of the Elven people into the Azure of Ulthuan, and their now eternal nemesis, the Druki of Nagaroth, led by the Witch King. The Ogres are on their forced migration away from the Great Maw that devastated their home in the eastern steppes, and the cut-off Dwarfs in the eastern holdings had turned to the worship of Hashut for their salvation. Of the humans outside of the simple peasants of Cathay scraping a subsistence living as arable farmers under the thrall of the Dragon Emperor, most are still primitive nomads, little more advanced than the savage orc and goblin tribes, and at the mercy of the beastmen that hunt them as prey. Over the next few centuries, we will see the rise of the first great true human civilization, the land that will give the Old World one of its most successful leaders. One who does not serve, he rules. I hope you've enjoyed our journey through the most ancient times of the Old World, and I'll see you again, in the near future, where there is only war.